Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we have an interesting chorale. We have der du bist, drei in Einigkeit, which translates to thou who art three in unity. This is an interesting chorale because I believe there is some modality afoot. It's really interesting seeing this idea of a D minor mode being juxtaposed with G major. If we're looking at pure D minor and G major, they are distant keys, and seeing them operate in tandem with one another is, or I guess in sequence with one another, would be unusual. We have seen some chorales whose harmonic relationships have been distant like that, but it's definitely uncommon. I think the little twist, however, is that because we're using not D minor but D Dorian, at least that's my argument, is that we're using the D Dorian mode here, is that it takes the D minor sound and moves it one step closer to G major because of the B natural rather than the B flat. And we do see C sharp here. I do think that has to do more so with just bringing D minor back into the forefront because of the use of the leading tone. You know, even Renaissance composers use the leading tone in that context. It's very fascinating chorale. I'm going to present the analysis that I have in the fashion that I have it here, but this is definitely a head scratcher for sure, and there's a lot to discuss despite how short of a chorale this is. So we start on D minor, we end on G major. Even though I think the overall tonality of this chorale is G major, we start off with this D Dorian idea, and that's just how it is. D Dorian as a minor scale, I guess, or an adaptation of the minor scale, is closer in terms of pitch relationship to G major, and I think that that's fascinating because Bach is keeping the keys adjacent to one another. So D minor is functioning as our one chord here, and then we move to E, G, C, and G, this D being a 7-6 suspension over the bass. C major over E is 7-6. Subtonic seventh, not always actually usually it isn't indicative of modality going on, but the subtonic seventh is something that we see more commonly in the modes than we do in tonal minor because of the presence of the leading tone. But even in like a modal context, we see the leading tone used. Regardless, I think the next progression is more interesting. The fact that we're going from a subtonic seventh to G, G, C, and D. This C is a 4-3 suspension, and this B natural is our chord tone, making this a G major chord, which would be 4 in the context of D Dorian. So we have some transitive harmony following the cycle of falling fifths. 4 typically wants to go to 7, but here we see it going the other way around. That's all well and good, but the fact that G is major is a clear indication that even though D minor is functioning as our tonic here, G major being used in this stable context with a subtonic seventh really does make this feel like Dorian. But like I mentioned earlier, we do have C sharp in here as well. That's just to bring focus back towards D, which is our tonic, and does pretty much clarify the fact that D is functioning like our pitch center in this particular chorale at this point. But we are going to be modulating to G major at some point because we cadence in G major, and it doesn't just happen right at the end. It does modulate earlier than just the last two beats of the cadence. But we eventually go from 4 to 1. That's a plagal progression, 4 going to 1. D, A, D, and F natural. Very unusual progression. Very, very unusual. But that's clearly what's happening here. And with the idea of modality in our minds, it's a little bit more justified and reasonable. It's not like super confusing as to what Bach was trying to achieve here. It's just he's using a modal pitch collection, and his harmonic vocabulary changes to accommodate that. Little passing seventh here in the alto before we get E minor, E, G, B, and G. Again, another chord that we would find in D Dorian, as opposed to E diminished, which would require B flat. We have E minor, E, G, B natural, and G. Also, the fact that it is following a C natural makes it that much more modal as well. So this E minor chord would be our 2 chord in the key of D minor, or D Dorian in this case, and it's also going to be our pivot chord to the key of G major. It becomes 6, and if you know anything about Bach's authentic cadences, you probably know what's going to happen after the 6th chord. Passing 7th in the bass, C, G, E, and A. That's A minor 7 over C. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential situations. D, F sharp, D, and A. It's D major, which is our 5 chord. Passing 7th in the alto, and our perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major ends with G. G, D, B, and G. Tonic triad, root position. And then we're going to see a phrase that, for all intents and purposes, is identical to the previous phrase. Really, the only difference is the fact that the tenor goes from F sharp to C, rather than the alto going down from D to C. So really, it's the exact same phrase. It's just the tenor is singing the note that the alto is singing. So we can just hop right into it. So G here, I think, functions as a pivot chord, back to this idea of D Dorian. It is our 4 chord, and we saw 4 go to 1 earlier. Sort of smooths out the transition, it's like self-realizing. It fulfills the cycle that goes back into the chord progression for the second phrase. We start off with our tonic, D minor, D, F, D, and A. D is a 7-6 suspension, E, G, C, and G is another 7-6 chord, subtonic 7 chord. Then we have G, G, C, and D, another 4 chord. The C is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. C sharp's a little brief passing tone. D, A, D, and F is our tonic triad again, D minor. Passing 7th of the alto, E, G, B, and G. Again, another one of these 2 chords that's minor because we're dealing with a mode here. Either a mode or some variation of the melodic minor scale because of that natural or raised 6th scale degree. But this is still going to be our pivot point back to the key of G major. It becomes our 6th chord. Passing 7th in the bass, C, G, E, and A. That's another A minor 7 chord in first inversion. Bach still loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. D, F sharp, D, and A is our 5 chord, D major. A little 7 there, that's a non-chord tone in this context, but it is our chordal 7th. And perfect authentic cadence here ends with our tonic G major, G, B, D, and G. So we're actually going to briefly visit the key of C major before we move to the end of this phrase here, which ends in a half cadence in the key of D minor. So Bach is hopping all over the place here in terms of keys, but this middle phrase is really what's providing the variety here in the form, because so far, if you're looking ahead to what's happening in the last phrase, we have like A, B, A form, and the B is really a pretty, I guess, not really comparable phrase in comparison to the 2 previous phrases. It does offer quite a bit of variety. But similar to the way that our previous phrase elided with the next key, I do believe this G major chord is also functioning like 5 in the key of C major. We do move to F, C, F, and A. The F natural here would not be diatonic to the key of G major. It would be diatonic to C major. So we have a bit of a deceptive progression here, 5 going to 4, F major, F, C, F, and A with a passing 7th in the bass, and that takes us to D, D, F, and B, which is B diminished in first inversion 7-6. 4 going to 7-6 is a good sign. It's a normative progression and something that we would expect in a chorale. We then have C, G, F, and C. So F is a 4-3 suspension, but really what's being implied here is a C major chord, C, G, E, and C. And we're now looking for a point in which we're starting to modulate to the key of D minor. However, Bach does that with this over a series of these interesting chromatic ascending bass lines, F natural, F sharp, and G. The second one's a little bit easier to analyze than what's going on here, which is a little bit more contrapuntal and convoluted because of that. So we have F, A, E, and A. That would be an F major 7 chord without the 5th. So even though I think that 4-7 is a viable analysis for this, I think this is actually a 7/6 suspension, and this F natural and this E become non-chord tones because the bass changes by the time it resolves. So this A coincidentally is a chord tone of the chord that's going to happen. This B is a little passing tone, and really the chord that we're looking at is F sharp, C, D, and A, which is D7 over F sharp. And that would be 5/6/5 of 5, because D is the dominant of G, and G is our 5 chord, and that's exactly where it goes. G, C, D, and G, and the C being a 4/3 suspension over the bass. It says B, that's our chord tone. It's our 5 chord. But unlike the chord, unlike, what was I about to say? Oh goodness, I just lost my train of thought mid-sentence. That's not good. I was going to talk about modulation zones. So this G major chord, as we've seen in the past, is a potential pivot back to the key of D minor. This is the beginning of a modulation zone because the end of our phrase is going to be in the key of D minor. I think you could say that it happens as early as this 4 chord. And in fact, I would be inclined to say that that was the case if it weren't for the fact that this ascending chromatic bass line here is, I guess, it feels like it starts off with a resolution to this 5 chord, which is C major, C, C, E, and G. So G major resolving where we would expect. And then we get this quick turnaround where this our expectations are sort of subverted by this B flat here, as well as the C sharp, B flat, E, and G. Definitely more of a nod towards D minor rather than D Dorian, because we have both the leading tone and the flat 6. And what would be implied here is C sharp diminished, fully diminished 7th in root position, which is 7/7 of 2. And then we resolve to 2, D, A, E, and F. As we know, Bach loves this 9/8 suspension over a D minor chord. Don't know what it is about D minor chords, but Bach loves doing this 9/8 suspension in the alto over a D minor chord. So this is our 2 chord, which in the key of D minor is also our 1. Again, this could be a modulation zone. G could be 4, C could be 7, this could be 7/7 of 2, and this could be 1. The reason why I don't hear it this way is because this 5 going to 1 just sounds very clearly like a resolution in the key of C major, especially after tonicizing the dominant. It just feels natural to analyze it that way. And because this fully diminished 7th shares a beat with this C major chord, it just feels like the modulation happens over the chord that is being tonicized rather than earlier. But of course, there's room for interpretation here, and I don't think any one analysis is correct. Just by the time we get to the cadence, it's very clear that we are in the key of D minor. However, instead of cadencing on D minor, this is a half cadence. We cadence on the dominant, which is A major, A, C sharp, and E. Which is interesting because, in a modal chorale, there's really no reason why we couldn't cadence on the dominant in a modal chorale. It's just we go from this idea of D Dorian being our pitch collection early on to D minor being our pitch collection later on. It's kind of interesting how the D minors are being juxtaposed, as well as the keys that are adjacent to D minor are being juxtaposed as well. Just interesting choices of pitch collections in this chorale. But like I mentioned earlier, A, B, A form, we're going to see a phrase that's basically a carbon copy of the first 2 phrases. A is going to continue to be the 5 and this idea of D, but we're going to see the same idea of D Dorian moving forward. D, A, D, and F is our tonic, D minor, passing 7th in the alto, E, G, B, and G. This B I think is a lower suspension. Maybe you can make an argument it's a 2 chord. I still think this is 7/6, but 2 versus 7/6, they're very similar chords and they'd be functioning the same way too. But I think it makes more sense this is a 7/6 chord because the phrases are very similar and the chord progressions are basically identical to one another. But 7/6 does go where we would expect 2/4, and when I say it goes where we would expect, I don't mean under normal circumstances that's where it would go, but based on the context of this individual chorale, we would expect this 7/6 chord to go to 4 because we've seen the phrase twice in the past. G, G, C, and D is a 4/3 suspension over the bass in the alto, but we know that this is G major in root position. We're passing leading tone here in the alto as well before we get D minor, D, A, D, and F. It's our tonic triad here. passing 7th of the alto, E, G, B, and G. Our 2 minor chord here, because remember we're thinking in Dorian, and this is going to be our pivot back to the key of G major. Passing 7th in the bass, C, G, E, and A. Another A minor 7 chord in first inversion, 2, 6, 5. Before we move to D major, D, F sharp, D, and A. It's our 5 chord, and we're going to end our chorale with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G, G, D, B, and G, G major root position after those passing 7th in the alto. And that is this analysis. Very fascinating chorale. I think, Bach obviously is sort of a scientist in the sense that he is given a melody and he experiments with different configurations of what could potentially be a reasonable harmonization using the melody as a point of inspiration, right? And in theory, there are tons of different ways that you could interpret the melody and fit them into different chordal possibilities. It just depends on how far he's veering away from the conventions of the time. And I would make an argument that this chorale is much further along the spectrum, to the point where it's pretty extreme in terms of his interpretation of what's going on here. Like how he thought, oh, I'm going to move from this idea of D Dorian to G major. It's not where I would expect Bach's mind to go. Modality is definitely not the first place I would expect Bach to go, despite the fact that he has demonstrated that he writes using modal vocabulary sometimes. But this just happens to be one of those anomalies that exists in his writing, and it's really cool that we encountered it. This is not the first modal chorale we've seen, and I suspect will be the last one that we see. But that's pretty much all that I have to say. All in all the tonal sections are fairly straightforward. Nothing really throws us for a loop. We do have some modulation zones, which of course, you might say, oh, he modulates a beat earlier or he modulates a beat later. What really matters is that he's modulating, and wherever you mark it is what makes sense to you. That's pretty much everything that I have to say, other than the modality and the chromatic bass lines. That's pretty much it. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon as well, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.